A few days after the wedding, I was at home when the doorbell rang. I checked the monitor, and there was Betty, my son Joseph's wife, standing alone.
"I'm here to talk to you, Sandra. Please open the door."
I opened the door and let Betty into the house. What could she possibly want? She came to my house without Joseph and without any notice.
"Joseph told me that you and your husband are divorced, right?"
She asked out of nowhere. I could sense she had an agenda, but I calmly replied, "Yes, that's right. It was when Joseph was still very young. But why does that matter?"
"Oh? Well, since you're single, I didn't expect much about inheritance. But as your daughter-in-law, I thought it was wise to check on the assets."
Now I understood why Betty came over without Joseph. This daughter-in-law of mine came to see how much savings I had. When Betty realized she wouldn't get any money out of me, she said,
"Actually, I came here today because I have a favor to ask you, Sandra."
"A favor?" I asked, and Betty nodded, smiling. I had a terrible feeling about this.
"Well, I'd like to sever ties with you since we're practically strangers now."
Betty blurted out.
"Strangers?" "Yes, exactly. So, from now on, please stay out of our lives. I absolutely don't want to be responsible for taking care of you. Let's sever ties completely."
Betty said this with a cheerful laugh, leaving me utterly speechless. Seeing that I couldn't say anything, Betty stood up, seemingly satisfied. Then she said,
"So, Joseph and I won't be in touch with you anymore, Sandra. And please don't contact us either. I'm leaving now."
With that, she walked out of the house. My name is Sandra. I'm in my 60s, living alone in a rural town, relying on my pension. In my younger days, I was a real workaholic, so I managed to save quite a bit of money. I grew up in a poor family, so I started working right after high school. I didn't want to go to college. I wanted to start earning money as soon as possible. I met my husband, Charles, at the company where we both worked. Charles was about the same age as me, and we bonded over shared interests, eventually starting a relationship. When I first met Charles, he had dreams of starting his own business.
"I've been saving up money because I want to make my dream come true."
"That's an amazing dream. I'll help you," I said, and Charles smiled happily. Then he said,
"How about we get married when I achieve my dream of starting a business?"
Charles held my hand and promised me that. To support Charles, I worked as hard as I could. Thanks to that, a year after making that promise, Charles successfully started his business. And as promised, we really did get married. Soon after, our son Joseph was born, and we became a family of 3. Our life wasn't very stable, but we enjoyed small moments of happiness and lived a joyful life. However, that happiness didn't last long. I discovered that Charles, whom I had trusted, was having an affair. We had many discussions as a couple, but Charles chose his mistress, and we ended up getting a divorce. It was a shock to end up like this, but I couldn't afford to be down. I had Joseph, so I couldn't just stop moving forward. I worked as hard as I could while raising Joseph on my own, managing to get by somehow. We never lived a wealthy life, but things were more stable than when Charles had just started his business. It was easier to save money too. After that, Joseph grew up well, studied diligently, and got into college. I covered all of Joseph's college expenses. I wanted him to go through college without any worries. The savings I had built up for Joseph's future finally came in handy. As a parent, there's no greater joy.
"Thanks, Mom. I'll work hard so I can repay you someday,"
Joseph said to me, with tears in his eyes. There's no need for repayment. Just seeing him live healthily and happily is all I need to be content. Joseph graduated from college and got a job at a prestigious company in the city. When Joseph became independent, I decided to sell the house and move into an apartment by myself. There was no longer a home for Joseph to return to, but actually, the move was Joseph's idea.
Mom, I think it's time for you to start living your own life.
My own life?
Yes. I'll be living on my own, and you should do whatever makes you happy. Like selling this big house and moving somewhere new.
Joseph was right. This house had originally been mine after the divorce from Charles. We didn't have much money back then, but we managed to buy this house at a bargain. The old house was falling apart in places, and I had started to feel that living there was becoming impossible. But Joseph's words opened my eyes to new possibilities. Moving, huh? I hadn't even thought about that.
There are apartments for single people these days, you know. I think you'd be more comfortable living like that, Mom.
Joseph's words made even more sense to me. So, I decided to move into an apartment. Since I had reached the age where I could receive my pension, I shifted to a lifestyle where I worked fewer hours while collecting my pension. I never thought that at this age, I would be living a completely different life. I was quite excited about imagining what my new life would be like. Living alone in an apartment turned out to be very fulfilling. However, spending more time at home didn't feel entirely comfortable. As a workaholic and someone who grew up poor, I wasn't used to this slow-paced lifestyle. One day, while living this way, Joseph came to visit me at my apartment.
Mom, it's been a while.
Joseph looked slightly more mature than the last time I saw him, but that gentle smile hadn't changed. Seeing him like that reassured me. It seemed like he was enjoying his life, even after starting to live alone. It's been a while. But why the sudden visit?
Well, there's something I want to talk to you about,
Joseph said, looking a little shy. I was curious but invited him in, saying, "Come on in."
Actually, I'm thinking of getting married. Married!
Joseph's unexpected words made me ask again, unable to believe it. The idea that Joseph, of all people, was talking about marriage was surprising, to say the least. I had never once heard him talk about any relationships with women.
Who is she? She's a senior at my company. Her name is Betty.
She's older than you? I responded, and Joseph blushed. Joseph had always had a thing for older women since he was young. It seemed that even as an adult, his taste hadn't changed.
I just proposed to her recently, and she said yes. So now we're talking about submitting the marriage certificate and having a wedding. I see. Well, congratulations.
I was so surprised that I almost forgot to say it, but I quickly offered Joseph my congratulations. Hearing that made Joseph look very happy. As I listened to him talk more, it seemed that his fiancée, Betty, had a bit of a strong personality. Joseph, who had always been the quiet type, seemed to be guided by her. No matter who she was, if Joseph chose her, I was ready to accept her.
We couldn't bring her today, but Betty wants to meet you, so we'll come by another time.
Got it. I'm looking forward to it. But, Joseph.
What is it?
I gently reminded Joseph.
Next time, let me know ahead of time when you're coming.
I might not always be home. Joseph looked like he had completely forgotten, with a sheepish expression. He must have been eager to tell me the news and came over right away. He could have just called, but he went out of his way to come and see me in person. I'm deeply grateful to Joseph for always thinking about me. The next time I heard from Joseph was a week later. On the day he said he'd bring Betty, I woke up early in the morning, nervous and waiting for Joseph. Betty seemed to be strong-willed, but I couldn't gauge how much. Since I only knew what Joseph told me, I couldn't make any judgments. Honestly, I was a bit anxious. While I was thinking about that, the doorbell rang. I checked the monitor, saw Joseph, and headed for the door. "Welcome." I greeted them, and there stood Joseph with a woman. "Mom, this is Betty, the one I've been seeing." "Betty, this is my mom." Joseph introduced us to each other, and I smiled at Betty standing before me. "Nice to meet you, Betty." "Thanks for coming all this way." I greeted her, but Betty just stared at me without a smile. It felt like I was being observed, almost like an examination. Her demeanor was far from what you'd expect from someone coming to meet a family member for the first time. At that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After what felt like a long pause, Betty finally said, "Nice to meet you, I'm Betty," in a tone that sounded more like an obligation than a greeting. As much as I hate to admit it, while Betty was scrutinizing me, I was also taking in her appearance. Her features were sharp, her makeup was heavy. Her clothes were flashy. It was clear from the brand of her bag that it was expensive. Of course, I couldn't judge her character based on these observations, but I couldn't help noticing. I invited the two of them inside, and we sat down to talk. The first topic of conversation was the wedding. As soon as the wedding was mentioned, Betty's eyes widened, and she leaned forward.
"The wedding has been my dream since I was little."
"Oh, really?"
"That's why I refuse to compromise. I'm going to push through all of my wishes, so make sure you're prepared for that, Joseph's mom."
Betty directed this comment straight at me. "Well, good luck with that," I responded, a bit taken aback. Why was Betty telling me this? It made sense if she was declaring this to Joseph, her soon-to-be husband, but why was she telling me? I looked at Joseph, a little worried about the future, but he seemed unbothered, smiling at Betty. That made me even more concerned. After discussing future plans, Joseph and Betty left. I was deeply relieved that it was finally over. Still, Betty seemed like quite a handful. Her intense focus on the wedding was one thing, but her indifference to any other topic was also troubling. Should I just stand by and watch these two? These thoughts crossed my mind as I observed the interactions between Joseph and Betty that day. But Joseph was an adult now, and there wasn't much I could do for him. So, I decided not to intervene any further. That should have been the end of it, but a few days later, Joseph came by again. This time, however, he looked deeply troubled.
"What happened?"
"After we met, Betty and I went to a wedding planning meeting a few days later. But the costs were much higher than I expected," Joseph said, looking downcast. He explained that he and Betty had been making steady progress in their wedding preparations. But during the meeting, Joseph was shocked by the total cost. I thought, of course. It was clear from Betty's previous talk that it was going to be an extravagant wedding. When they came to visit me, she had already mentioned wanting to have the ceremony at a certain theme park, so naturally, it was going to be more expensive than usual. Costs are unavoidable. I know, but I already decided that I would pay for everything, and now I can't back out," Joseph replied, his voice filled with resignation. It seemed that Joseph intended to cover the entire cost of the wedding himself. Despite it being Betty's dream wedding, she wasn't contributing any money. I couldn't help but feel uneasy and suspicious about that, but Joseph said, "But Betty wants her dream wedding. I really want to make that happen for her," making it clear that he wanted to prioritize Betty's wishes. "But do you even have that kind of money?" "If you did, that's fine, but the fact that you came here means you don't, right?" "If I don't have enough, I'll consider taking out a loan. That's why I wanted to tell you about this first, Mom." Joseph answered my question, looking very serious. He was clearly not joking. The fact that he wasn't asking for money was likely because he assumed a single mom like me wouldn't have much. I took an envelope out of a drawer and handed it to Joseph.
Here, use this. Huh? What's this? I was planning to give this to you when you became independent. There's about $40,000 in it.
When I said that, Joseph's eyes widened in surprise. In truth, I had been saving money for Joseph's future. I never imagined it would come in handy this soon, especially not for the wedding.
That should be enough, right?
I asked, and Joseph's eyes lit up.
Mom, thank you so much,
he said, tears of joy streaming down his face. I was slightly exasperated by his reaction, but at the same time, I couldn't help but find it endearing. Joseph is truly a kind soul. Even now, as an adult, he still puts others' needs before his own. For someone like Joseph, I didn't mind giving up $40,000, even if it was for something as extravagant as his fiancée's dream wedding. I decided to keep it a secret that I had covered the entire wedding cost. There was no need for Betty to know. After that, Joseph and Betty went ahead with their wedding at the theme park as planned. When I arrived at the venue on the day of the wedding, I was stunned by how extravagant it was. At that point, I understood why it was so expensive. Betty was in high spirits the whole time, and Joseph looked genuinely happy watching her. If that money helped make their day special, then it was worth it. And so, the beautiful wedding went off without a hitch. A few days after the wedding, I was at home when the doorbell rang. I checked the monitor, and there was Betty, Joseph's wife, standing alone.
Betty? What brings you here?
I called out, and Betty smiled, saying, I'm here to talk to you, Sandra. Please let me in.
Sure, come in.
I opened the door and let Betty into the house. What could she possibly want? She came to my house without Joseph and without any notice. I motioned for Betty to take a seat. Betty started looking around the house again. I braced myself, wondering what she was about to say, when she narrowed her eyes and looked at me. Then she asked,
Joseph told me that you're divorced from your husband, right, Sandra?
The unexpected question made me pause as I was preparing tea. But I smiled gently, not wanting to show any unease, and replied,
Yes, that was when Joseph was very young. What happened to the alimony from that time? Do you still have it? I used it for Joseph's education and other things. But why do you ask?
I shot back, still smiling, at Betty, who was boldly asking such direct questions. I was slightly shaken, but my irritation toward Betty far outweighed that. Betty, unfazed by my silent resistance, calmly responded,
Oh? Since you're single, I wasn't expecting much. But as your daughter-in-law, I thought it would be wise to check on the assets.
I see now. I finally understood why Betty had come to my house without Joseph. This daughter-in-law of mine wanted to find out how much I had in savings. Even Joseph, my own son, didn't know about my savings. That was the rule I had set when I decided to give him that $40,000. If they knew about the money, they might start relying on me, and I couldn't have that. This savings was money I had put aside for myself, and I had no intention of giving it to Joseph or anyone else. Betty, sensing that she wouldn't be able to get any money from me, remarked,
I guess living on just a pension and part-time wages leads to a rather modest lifestyle.
That's all I needed to know. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to adjust. It seemed I had successfully kept the truth hidden. As I kept smiling, Betty's gaze became even sharper as she looked at me.
Actually, I came here today because I have a favor to ask you, Sandra. A favor?
I asked, and Betty nodded, smiling. I had a really bad feeling about this.
I'm now part of Joseph's family. Which means that Joseph and I are a separate family from you, Sandra, right? What are you trying to say? Well, I'd like to sever ties with you since we're practically strangers now,
Betty declared.
Strangers? That's right, isn't it? So from now on, I want you to stay out of our lives. I absolutely don't want to be responsible for your care, so let's just cut ties completely.
Betty said this with a cheerful smile, leaving me in shock. She showed up at my house unannounced, pried into my finances and alimony, and now that she knew she wouldn't be getting anything, she wanted to cut ties. This was pure madness. Is this how a daughter-in-law treats her mother-in-law? I couldn't find any words to respond, and Betty, satisfied, stood up. Then she said,
So, Joseph and I will never contact you again, and you should do the same. I'm leaving now.
With that, she left the house immediately. I was too stunned to say anything back to the whirlwind Betty. For a while, I was in shock, but then I quickly came to my senses and called Joseph. There's no way the kind-hearted Joseph would agree to cut ties with me as Betty had said. Thinking this must be some kind of mistake, I gripped my phone tightly with trembling hands. Fortunately, Joseph answered right away.
Joseph! Betty just came over and said she wants to cut ties with me. Do you really intend to do that too?
I asked frantically, and Joseph responded as if he was just remembering. Well, Betty wants that, so I'm going along with it. If Betty doesn't want to have anything to do with you, I think it's best to respect her wishes. She declared this bluntly. The moment I heard it, my mind went completely blank. Unbelievable. Was Joseph really willing to obey Betty's every word, even when it came to such an important matter as our family ties? I was utterly disappointed in Joseph. The kind and considerate Joseph I thought I knew was nothing but an illusion. I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, Mom. But from now on, I think it's best that we live our lives without relying on each other. Not relying on each other is different from cutting ties. But you see, Betty doesn't want any connection with you, and if that's the case, I think it's unavoidable. I was stunned. At the same time, I felt a strong sense of shock and almost wanted to blurt out everything Betty had said. But I swallowed my words and calmly replied, Fine. Then you should no longer rely on me either. Consider the money I spent on your wedding as a severance payment. From now on, I won't be offering any more support. I calmly responded. Joseph responded with, I understand. His reaction made it seem like he didn't fully grasp the gravity of cutting ties with his own mother. After hearing Joseph's response, I ended the call. Once I hung up, I couldn't move for a while. I felt a deep sense of regret toward Joseph, who didn't acknowledge the $40,000 I had spent on his wedding. There was also resentment toward Betty, who had caused the rift between us. But above all, I was devastated by how our mother-son bond had been severed in such a manner. A few hours later, I called my friend Nancy and headed out to a pub to drink. Nancy is my best friend from our school days. We know everything about each other, including Joseph.
Wow, it sounds like Joseph is completely under his wife's control.
That's exactly what I thought. I was venting to Nancy about what had happened today. Nancy listened patiently, as she always does. I tried to act like it didn't bother me, but honestly, I'm really hurt. Betty asked me so many questions about money, and now it feels like Joseph only approached me about the wedding costs because they were after my money.
It does seem like they were testing you, hoping you'd offer to cover the costs. Maybe they thought if they mentioned taking out a loan, you'd step in to help.
Hearing Nancy say that made me feel even more deflated. I had given $40,000 to my son and his wife, who turned out to be manipulative and selfish. I couldn't help but feel that I had been naive, that I had misjudged them completely. What will become of me now? I was filled with a vague sense of anxiety about the future.
So, why not use the money you've saved to do something you love?
Do something I love? Nancy's unexpected suggestion made me look up in surprise. She smiled.
Why not go somewhere without Joseph and his wife? Like, move abroad.
As she said this, she pulled out something to show me. It was a plane ticket. The destination was the capital, Kuala Lumpur.
Malaysia? Yes. I was actually going to invite you on this trip. How about it? Why don't we take a vacation and explore before deciding if we want to move there?
Nancy smiled warmly. Whenever I was going through tough times, Nancy was always there to support me. Nancy lost her husband a few years ago and has been living alone ever since. She's full of energy and seems to thoroughly enjoy her single life. To clear my mind, I decided to join Nancy on a trip to Malaysia. I boarded a plane, something I hadn't done in years, and headed to Malaysia. The experience of flying again after so long made me incredibly nervous. Everything in Malaysia felt new and refreshing. We visited the Petronas Twin Towers, which I had only ever seen in pictures, and toured various other attractions. Both Nancy and I could speak a little Malay due to work, so we didn't struggle with the language barrier at all. We were able to enjoy the trip without any issues. It was genuinely fun.
You know, I've always planned on moving abroad.
One night, back at our accommodation, Nancy said this while gazing at the night sky.
I always wanted to invite you too, Sandra, but I held back because you had Joseph. But the truth is, I've always wanted to live here with you. Really? With me?
I was surprised by Nancy's unexpected confession. She had always needed me. Thinking about that warmed my heart. Nancy smiled gently at me and asked, "What do you think, Sandra? Didn't you feel like you might want to live here?" As she asked me this, I seriously considered Nancy's words. Malaysia is far cheaper than the US. With my savings and pension, I could live comfortably here. Language wouldn't be an issue either, given our current skills. And living with Nancy would certainly be exciting and fun. Rather than feeling anxious, I started to look forward to what the future might hold.
I think I'd like that. Living here with you sounds like it would be a lot of fun.
When I said that, Nancy's face lit up with a joyful smile. It was time to forget about Joseph. From now on, I wasn't his mother anymore, and I didn't need to worry about him or Betty. I could finally spend my time on myself, doing what made me happy. After returning to the US, Nancy and I began the process of planning our move. After various preparations and some hassle, Nancy and I were finally able to make it to Malaysia together. Once we were there, I realized that living in a place is quite different from just visiting as a tourist. However, I was having a great time with Nancy every day. Before I knew it, a year had passed since we moved to Malaysia. I had grown accustomed to my new life and was thoroughly enjoying my days. One day, I received a call on my smartphone. The caller ID showed that it was coming from the US. When I checked the number closely, I saw it was from Joseph, the son with whom I had cut ties. At first, I ignored the calls, wondering what he could possibly want now, but Joseph kept calling persistently. Feeling conflicted, I decided to consult with Nancy, and eventually, I reluctantly decided to answer the phone just once.
Mom, it's been a while. It's me.
As soon as I picked up, I heard Joseph's cheerful voice. Joseph's voice hasn't changed a bit, even after all this time. But that didn't erase the feelings I had from our last encounter.
Who is this? What? What are you talking about? It's your son, Mom.
Joseph responded happily, but his cheerfulness only made me more wary. Joseph and I had severed ties. I never thought we would be in contact again. So why was he calling me now? I took a deep breath and regained my composure. Then I said, "I was disowned, remember? I don't have a son anymore." "I know, and I'm really sorry about that. I'm asking for your forgiveness." Joseph's tone was light, almost as if he hadn't heard a word I said. I had no intention of ever forgiving Joseph, but I figured I might as well hear him out. "So, what do you want?"
Actually, we had a baby.
Joseph's voice was full of joy. At that moment, I motioned for Nancy to come over and switched the phone to speaker mode so she could listen in.
A baby? You're a grandmother now, Mom. We want you to come visit.
Is that so?
Betty's here with me right now. She wants you to come visit us too. I'll hand the phone over to her now.
Joseph handed the phone to Betty, and I heard her irritating, obnoxious voice say, "Sandra, it's been a while." I sighed and decided not to respond to Betty. Nancy, standing beside me, was shaking with laughter at my obvious reaction. "Sandra, it's your grandchild. You should bring a gift and come see us. We went to your house, but we were surprised to find out you had moved." As soon as I heard Betty's words, my suspicions were confirmed. It seemed that Joseph and Betty, now with a baby, were in need of money. Desperate, they had decided to turn to me, thinking I might still have some. They probably thought that telling me I had a grandchild would make me happy and willing to help. From what Betty said, it was clear they hadn't yet realized that I had moved abroad.
That's right. Mom, where are you living now? I'm not telling you. And besides, I don't have a son anymore, so that child isn't my grandchild.
My response clearly took them by surprise. And after a brief silence, Joseph spoke up.
Come on, are you still holding on to that? I said I was sorry.
Yeah, Sandra, don't be stubborn. Just come visit us, Betty added, sounding flustered. I exchanged a glance with Nancy and said, "If you can pay back the $40,000 I gave you for the wedding, I might consider forgiving you."
$40,000 for the wedding? Don't be ridiculous. That was money Joseph spent on me.
Oh? So, Joseph didn't tell you that he had no money and asked me for help? I told him that the $40,000 was my way of cutting ties. I could hear Joseph and Betty arguing on the other end of the line.
Wait, what is this about?
No, it's not like that. Nancy, trying to keep quiet, was laughing uncontrollably at the situation. Seeing her like that made me start to find it amusing too.
Aren't you too ashamed? I'm embarrassed to even think of you as my family.
Hearing this, they both quickly focused back on me.
Sandra, please wait. We're really grateful for what you did for the wedding. Let's just forget the past and get along. I want to see you, Mom. And anyway, that $40,000 was saved for me, wasn't it? So, I don't think we need to pay it back.
Desperate as they were, they started saying whatever came to mind, completely disregarding any sense of decency. Hearing this, I was beyond exasperated.
That's all in the past. If you hadn't cast me aside back then, you might still be benefiting from my support today.
Joseph, trying to mend things, responded.
But we can still make amends and get along, starting now.
Joseph was clearly trying to get me to forgive him. I could hear Betty in the background, adding her own comments to support him. I sighed in exasperation and said,
We're never going to see each other again. I'll never tell you where I am, and no matter how much you search, you won't find me. This is really the end. Goodbye.
Ignoring their frantic shouts, I hung up the phone. They're so clueless. Honestly, it's ridiculous. We looked at each other and laughed, then continued drinking. To make sure my phone wouldn't ring again, I turned it off. Later, following Nancy's suggestion, I decided to change my phone number. I was never good with technology, so I didn't know much about blocking calls or rejecting them. To make sure they couldn't contact me anymore, I decided to change my number completely. Before I did, I received one last call from a relative who told me that Joseph and Betty had been asking to borrow money. Apparently, Betty had been very reckless with her spending and had taken out loans from various companies. When I heard the full story, I learned that Betty had already been in debt by tens of thousands of dollars even before they got married. Those expensive designer bags, the long manicured nails, it all came from borrowed money. Honestly, I wasn't surprised. Knowing Betty, she was just putting on airs. Their fights over this eventually led to Joseph selling Betty's belongings to pay off some of the debt. But, of course, that didn't solve everything, and this led to a growing rift between them, which eventually ended in divorce. Betty got custody of their child and returned to her parents' home, but her sensible parents were furious when they heard what had happened. They took care of the child because they didn't want the grandchild to suffer, but they left Betty to fend for herself. Feeling abandoned, Betty started frequenting male strip clubs, sinking further into debt. While her parents took care of the child, Betty's life spiraled out of control. The thought of how her life would likely continue to deteriorate brought a wry smile to my face. Joseph didn't fare much better. In addition to paying child support, he was burdened with the embarrassment of having thrown a lavish wedding that everyone knew about, which made it impossible for him to admit the divorce. Instead, he kept up the facade of a happy marriage, but little by little, the truth came out, and his friends started distancing themselves from him. Now, Joseph's only companions are the women at hostess bars. With Betty addicted to male strip clubs and Joseph stuck in his own lonely spiral, it seemed the two of them were destined to follow similar, tragic paths. When I explained the situation and my decision to cut ties with Joseph to my relatives, they understood completely. No one would be reaching out to help them now. Joseph used to be a good, honest boy. But it seems being with Betty had completely changed him. That said, none of it mattered to me anymore. I had resolved to live my life free from the past. Now, I've started making jewelry with Nancy. It's just a hobby at the moment, but maybe one day we'll sell them. My second life has only just begun.
Enough of this racket! Get out of here with that baby, right now!
In the middle of the night, my husband was fed up with our babies crying. He shouted angrily, and just like that, he drove me and our 3-month-old daughter out of our home. With the change of seasons, the mornings and evenings were beginning to get chilly, and it looked like it was going to rain any minute.
I'm freezing! If we stay out here, we'll freeze to death.
Without a wallet or a coat, I began to shiver as the cold seeped into my bones.
Please, let us in.
Despite my constant knocking, there was no response from inside. Helpless, I wrapped my crying child tightly in her blanket to keep her warm, and we continued to walk.
I must protect my baby, at least.
Wandering aimlessly in the night, I was exhausted and found myself sitting on a bench in the park, frozen to the core. As I gazed up at the sky, the events that led us here played back in my mind.
How did we end up in this situation?
Tears that I could no longer hold back streamed down my cheeks. My name is Olivia, and I am 31 years old. My parents divorced when I was in middle school, and my mother single-handedly sent me to college. 2 years ago, while crossing a pedestrian lane, she was hit by a car and passed away. In exchange for a huge accident compensation, I lost my only family member, leaving me in a state of despair. During this time, Benjamin, who was my college classmate and now my husband, was there to support me.
Olivia, you can always lean on me when times are tough.
His kind words comforted my aching heart, and we started dating. A year later, he proposed, and we got married. I was grateful that we were blessed with a child so soon, and I thought we could build a happy family.
I'm pregnant. We're already 3 months along. What? Are you serious?
I thought he would be thrilled, but since he learned about the pregnancy, my husband strangely became distant. Not only that, his attitude became increasingly cold.
What is this dinner? Isn't this just fast food?
I'm sorry. Morning sickness hit me hard. I couldn't cook.
If you can't even manage now, I worry about the future. Useless.
The only thing I could do was watch my husband's back as he stormed off after his harsh words. Even when my belly became heavy and bending down became a challenge, he wouldn't lend a hand. Still, I believed that once our baby was born, he would return to his kinder self. After the birth, he visited the hospital right away, but after that he never showed his face, claiming he was busy with work. When I was discharged, I had to take our daughter home alone. And that's when the real nightmare started. When my daughter and I got home, my husband began yelling loudly every night.
The baby's crying is too noisy. I have work tomorrow. How am I supposed to sleep?
I understand where my hardworking husband, who supports us, is coming from, but I can't seem to soothe our crying daughter. If only my mom was here. With each passing day, I felt a deepening rift between my husband and me, plagued by a sense of loneliness. Even though our daughter is very quiet during the day, when night falls, it's as if she senses her father's tense and angry mood and starts to cry. I don't know what to do anymore. This life is the polar opposite of the warm and happy family I envisioned. My husband leaves all childcare responsibilities to me, claiming he's busy with work. On his days off, he'd say he can't relax at home and would go out. Running around all day taking care of a baby left me exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and our daughter's night crying seemed to get worse each day as if she could sense my distress. One night, my husband's anger reached its peak.
Get out of this house with that baby right now.
I can't do that. Before I could finish my sentence, my daughter and I were thrown out into the cold night. Without keys, a wallet, or a cell phone, I couldn't go back home and was left feeling helpless. I wrapped my daughter tightly in a blanket to keep her warm, held her close, and just kept walking until I sat down on a bench, cursing my life. We were supposed to be happy. How did it come to this? As if expressing my inner turmoil, my daughter started crying again, but I was too worn out to move. Just as I was starting to feel faint from the cold, an older woman's voice called out.
Are you okay?
Mom? For a moment, I thought my deceased mother had come from the afterlife. I lifted my face to see a stranger looking worried.
What are you doing in such a cold place?
My husband kicked me out because of our baby's crying.
Did you two have a fight? You'll catch a cold here. Come stay at my place.
But as I hesitated, not sure if I should impose on a stranger, she took my daughter from me, started soothing her, and my daughter suddenly became cheerful.
It's okay, don't worry. Let's go somewhere warm for the baby's sake.
Upon entering the house, my daughter was gently wrapped in a soft blanket to ward off the chill.
Drink this to warm up.
She even offered a warm glass of hot milk. My daughter, nestled in her arms, started to sleep peacefully, her gentle snores echoing in the quiet room.
I can't believe it. No matter how much I tried, she just wouldn't calm down. It can be quite tough if you're not used to it. I recently became a grandmother and I've been taking care of the little one occasionally. Maybe that's why I've become so sensitive to a baby's cries. I'm glad I decided to check on the noise.
Looking closely at the woman, her gentle smile tugging at the corners of her eyes, she was around the same age as my mother. The warmth of her atmosphere allowed me to feel at ease for the first time in a while. I'm sorry for intruding like this.
It's okay. We should help each other out in times of need. Do you need me to take you home? Do you live close by?
No, I might just get thrown out again. Seeing me stumble over my words, she kindly offered me to stay until morning. Her kindness moved me to tears again.
Thank you so much. My name is Olivia.
Wait a minute, isn't your baby's name in?
Yes, but how did you?
Turns out, this woman was Jackson, my husband's direct superior. She had sent us a gift when our daughter was born, so she remembered Anne's name. I was surprised at the coincidence and regretted complaining about my husband to her.
We're always grateful for your help. The thing is, my husband has been busy with work lately and he seems quite tired.
That can't be right. Your husband has been on parental leave for the past 2 months.
What? But he says he goes to work every day. He even said he has work tomorrow.
Tomorrow is a holiday, the office will be closed. I wonder what he's up to. I had no idea that my husband, who I thought was always working, was actually on vacation. However, I did notice a sense of excitement on the days he was supposed to be at work. Ever since I got pregnant, my husband's behavior has changed, and I've been feeling something off recently. As I wondered how to investigate my husband's actions, Jackson suggested an idea.
Why don't you check his social media? You can use this computer.
She pointed to a computer in the corner of the room and turned it on. I gratefully accepted her offer and started scanning my husband's social media. To my shock, I found a pile of photos of him and another woman. He must have thought I was too preoccupied with parenting and housework to ever notice. They look like a couple, don't they?
That's Ava. She worked at our company for only 3 months and recently quit.
No way. Although I had a hunch, I was too overwhelmed with my first experience of motherhood to consider it seriously. However, realizing he was truly having an affair was more shocking than I had anticipated.
Do you know her address? Her contact information?
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have mentioned her name. It's personal information and I can't disclose it.
Oh, right.
As I deflated, Jackson comforted me.
I'll do everything I can to help with anything else.
Hey, isn't this the Paris Hotel? I know it's a fancy place, and you've been here several times. Do you have that much money? True enough, there were numerous photos on social media of my husband and his mistress, the woman, indulging in luxury dining at the renowned Paris Hotel. As I was on maternity leave, there was no income, and my husband hadn't saved any money since we got married. There's no way he could have such disposable cash. No way, this can't be happening. With a prayerful heart, I checked my bank balance online and found that my savings of $250,000, which I received when my mother died in a car accident, had been halved. I was so shocked that I was unable to move for a while.
What's wrong?
My husband has been using my savings without my permission. I hadn't touched it at all because I was planning to use it for our daughter. Looking back, I had left my debit card in the card case with my husband when I was hospitalized for childbirth. Since that day, he hadn't visited me in the hospital even once. And the first time he withdrew from my savings was the day I handed him the debit card. I, who trusted my husband, thought he had locked it in a safe and didn't doubt him.
I can't forgive him. He's been using my beloved mother's inheritance without my permission.
We must punish the lying cheater. And the best way to do that is to secure evidence. With a smirk on his face, Jackson handed me a digital camera. The next day, as we watched from the car Jackson was driving near our house, my husband, humming a tune, hopped into his car and drove off.
He doesn't even worry about our daughter and me. Instead, he's making a fool of himself by being so excited.
As expected, my husband's car arrived at the Paris hotel. After a while, the mistress came and they casually linked arms and entered the hotel restaurant as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I asked Jackson to look after our daughter and sat quietly in a seat behind them. I've had enough of Olivia's stubbornness. Finally, I kicked her out last night. Now if she files for divorce, I'll get the compensation she received from her mother's car accident. If things go well, I might even get the alimony from the divorce trial. He.
You're a bad man. Your wife doesn't even realize that you're after her money.
Since her mother passed away, I've been very kind to her so that she'll never find out. But having a child was an unexpected obstacle. Listening to my husband's unbelievable words, my head went blank from the shock. Unaware of my feelings, my husband, swinging the key to the hotel room, heads for the elevator with the woman. When I secretly followed them, even though it was just a brief moment before the elevator arrived, the two of them began to hug and even start kissing. Even though I was prepared, seeing the affair in action was painful. A chill ran down my spine at my husband's voice, saying,
"This is a pre-celebration for kicking Olivia out. Let's have a blast today."
Unable to speak up, the two of them were swallowed up by the elevator. Left behind, I was so frustrated that I couldn't say anything, and I was overwhelmed with sadness and despair. I couldn't stand and fell to my knees right there. At that moment, the sadness that dominated my heart began to turn into a desire for revenge.
It's too cruel to betray me like this. I can't just let this go.
That evening, timing my return for when my husband got home from work, I made my way back to the house.
Well, look who's back.
I'm sorry. I'll do whatever you say from now on. Please, let me back in the house. To tighten the noose around him, I decided to play the part of the obedient wife for a little while, quelling my rising anger.
Fine. From now on, I'm not giving you any living expenses. Do whatever you want.
Understood. Without uttering a single word of disagreement, and not mentioning divorce, I was clearly annoying my husband. Despite his continued horrible attitude, I kept tolerating it. And while my husband pretended to be at work but was meeting his mistress, I was searching the house for evidence of his affair. I found several receipts for hotels and meals in his bag and suit pockets, but that alone seemed like weak evidence. So I traced his social media under the woman's name, and her identity was finally revealed. 2 weeks later, all the preparations were ready, and I once again visited the notorious Paris hotel. The two of them were nonchalantly having dinner and getting cozy in public as they did before. I approached them as they were about to get on the elevator. "What are you doing here?"
Why are you here? I'm obviously here for a work meeting.
Quickly shaking off the arm entwined with his mistress, my husband, looking guilty, tried to escape.
That's odd. Today's a day off, isn't it?
Hearing my strong, sharp voice, he turned around in surprise.
What? Jackson? You're supposed to be on parental leave, right? How come you're working? Well...
My husband, looking pathetic and flustered, had never dreamed I'd be with his boss. His mistress, the woman, also seemed quite surprised and was at a loss.
Hello, Ava. Long time no see. Yes.
The mistress called by name seemed nervous and unsure of what to do, looking down. The strange atmosphere was palpable, and I could feel the surrounding people staring at us.
Since we're drawing attention, let's move this to the room you guys booked. Unless you want me to scatter these photos around here, is that okay?
As I showed the photos that proved their affair to my staggering husband, he quickly grabbed my arm and pulled me into the elevator. Jackson caught the fleeing mistress and brought her along.
Why are you with Jackson?
The day you kicked me out, I had nowhere to go and was sitting in the park when Jackson heard our daughter crying and invited me in.
Seriously? It goes to show you can't do wrong and get away with it.
Upon entering the room, I dumped all the evidence I had gathered onto the table, leaving the two of them in shock.
What? These photos? I was here the day after you kicked me out of the house. It was shocking, but I took these as evidence of your affair. That's low. That's my line. Lying about work to meet your mistress and even taking parental leave, how despicable can you get?
My husband had no words for me, silenced by what I'd said. But I still had more to say.
I'm aware you used my savings without my consent. That money was a legacy from my mother. That's our shared property. I don't see an issue with me using it. What? It's not shared property. It's mine and mine alone. Really? Is that so? Yes, it is. So, you will return the $120,000 you used.
Come on, we're married.
Let's not get into such tedious matters.
Exhausted by his indifference, I swiftly pulled out the divorce papers from my bag and slammed them on the table.
I'm fed up with you. Fill out these divorce papers immediately. That's a leap, don't you think? Didn't I hear you say you wanted me to bring up divorce?
I played a recording of a conversation we had during a previous meal. His unbearable words echoed throughout the room.
Give me a break. Not a chance. To think you approached me just for my money. It all became clear after I heard our conversation from that day. That's why you became so cold all of a sudden. There's a lot to this situation. I don't want to hear any excuses or lies. Pay me $20,000 for the affair, $10,000 for all the times you mistreated me, $120,000 for the money you took from my savings, and $110,000 for child support until our daughter turns 20. That's a total of $260,000 in one lump sum. What? What mistreatment? You kicked me and our daughter out of the house in the middle of the night and didn't provide living expenses.
He clearly didn't expect his actions to become grounds for financial restitution in a divorce proceeding. Sweating profusely, his desperate plea for calm was pitiful.
Just calm down. Let's talk this out. Don't mock me. And don't think you're out of this either. I'll be seeking $20,000 in damages from you too.
When I pointed at his mistress, she turned pale.
I have to pay too? Of course. But in return, I'm divorcing him. So you two can be open about your relationship. That should be a relief, right? This is a problem.
I'm sorry. Forgive me. My desperate husband apologized while his mistress was speechless, her mouth gaping open. I took the house keys and card case from my husband's bag.
I sold the house that was in my name. Jackson reported everything to the company, and it seems you're going to be fired. When I told your parents about this, they were absolutely furious. They're considering cutting ties with you. So you've lost everything, haven't you?
Please, spare me this one time. I'll be a good husband, I promise. My husband's plea, his face a mess of tears and snot, was the most pitiful sight I'd ever seen, and it completely wiped away the last shreds of compassion I might have had for him. It's absolutely pathetic that he thought such a lie would work on me. We turned our backs on the sorry spectacle of those two and left the room. My husband was officially fired, losing not just his home but his workplace too. I didn't want to see my husband ever again, so I arranged for a divorce through a lawyer. I demanded compensation for the divorce, the money he had squandered, and child support. His parents were furious with him, and since he couldn't pay all the compensation in one go, his father forced him to work in a mine. He would have his wages garnished to pay me back. I got an immediate payment of $20,000 from his mistress. My daughter and I left the house we'd been living in, bought a small apartment, and started our new life. The moment we started living here, my daughter's night crying stopped completely. I'm really grateful for Jackson, who worries about us and calls us every now and then. Together with my daughter, I will build a happy, smile-filled home.